All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You know how we do it here. We pick a subject, we roll up our sleeves, and we dive in. And today, and knowing our listeners, I think a lot of you out there are going to be into this, we are taking a deep dive into the philosophy of Seneca, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, to give him his full name, one of the most important Stoic thinkers of the Roman imperial period.
Yeah, Seneca is someone I think any philosopher can find a lot to think about. He lived a really interesting life, born right around the turn of the millennium, 1 BCE, and died in 65 CE. And his life, he was exiled. He was one of Nero's advisors. He ultimately was forced to commit suicide. His life gave him a very particular perspective on the world. And I think, yeah, on the big question.
Yeah, I mean, accusations, banishment, power, death, all that stuff, we know he had to deal with firsthand. But when we look at his writing, and we'll be talking about his letters to Lucilius, his moral essays, his natural questions, they have this really personal feel. But they're not really straight autobiography, are they?
Right. He's not just telling you his life story. He's inviting the reader to reflect on their own lives. He's
Mhm.
using his experiences as a kind of springboard. I think that's what makes them so engaging.
Yeah. And in this deep dives, we're really going to use those three, his letters, essays, and the natural questions, to try to figure out what was so important about Seneca. How did he shape Stoicism? How did he engage with other philosophical schools? What did he have to say about the self, about emotions, ethics, even the natural world? I mean, he covers a lot of ground, but we're going to try to break it down for you.
And this is a good time to be looking at Seneca, I think, because over the past few decades, there's been this huge resurgence of interest in him. We're starting to appreciate Roman thought more. We understand Hellenistic philosophy better. And I think his ideas have a lot to say to us today, especially when we think about ethics.
Definitely. Okay, so where should we start? What was unique about how Seneca did philosophy?
Well, I mean, he's definitely a Stoic, right? He's operating within that system, but he's also really independent. Like, he feels totally free to disagree with the earlier Stoics or to bring in ideas from other philosophies. Like, he loved Plato.
So it's not like just accepting everything he's been taught.
No, he's thinking for himself. It's like, imagine being in a meeting, right? And everyone's throwing out ideas, and he's there engaging with each one, pushing back, adding his own perspective. He's not just passively absorbing, he's actively participating in this ongoing philosophical conversation.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It makes it sound more dynamic. Yeah. It's like dogma. You know, you mentioned earlier something about Seneca and his use of Latin. I mean, how did that affect the way he expressed these philosophical ideas?
It's really important. I mean, you think of someone like Cicero, right? He's very consciously trying to map Greek philosophical terms onto Latin equivalents. But Seneca, he's really thinking in Latin.
Like the language itself is shaping his thought.
Exactly. And I think it gives his writing this directness and power that you don't always get with Cicero.
Hmm. Interesting. So within Stoicism itself, I mean, we know it covered logic and physics and ethics, but where did Seneca really focus his attention?
Definitely ethics. I mean, he knew all the other stuff, but he wrote almost entirely about how to live a good life. He even calls philosophy a healing art. He saw it as a way to treat what he calls the sicknesses of the mind.
And I think that comes through in his writing style too, right? It's very engaging. It's very direct. Like he's talking directly to you like he's a therapist almost.
Absolutely. And I think that's partly why his letters to Lucilius are so powerful. He's writing as if to someone who's struggling, someone who's facing some kind of inner turmoil, and he's really trying to help them, to guide them.
It makes you feel like you're right there in the conversation with them. Okay, let's get into some of his big ideas. One that comes up a lot is cosmopolitanism. So how did Seneca, who, as we've said, was very engaged in the world around him, how did he think about being both a philosopher and a citizen?
Well, there was this traditional way of looking at it. There was the life of contemplation, the life of politics, the life of pleasure, right? And Seneca talks about these different paths. But he didn't think you had to pick just one.
Okay, so you could be both a philosopher and a politician.
Yeah. I mean, he sees them as two different worlds, but worlds that we belong to simultaneously. So you can be actively engaged in politics, trying to make your city a better place, but at the same time, you can be pursuing philosophy through your writing, your teaching, whatever it is you do, and through that, you're actually benefiting a much wider community.
Yeah, I see how those two things can work together. So how did he connect this to the idea of like a universal brotherhood, a connection between all people?
Well, the Stoics had this idea of koinonia, which means fellowship or community. And Seneca really embraced this idea. He uses the image of family, brothers and sisters,
Right.
to illustrate this connectedness. But he takes it even further. We're all part of this one big cosmos. He has this great line in on benefits. He says, God has granted two things that make this vulnerable creature the strongest of all: reason and fellowship.
Wow, powerful stuff.
Yeah.
Reason and fellowship. So it's like our ability to connect with each other, that's what makes us human. That's what gives us strength. Now, we were looking at the source material earlier, and it looks like there are some things in there that we might want to problematize a bit, regarding certain social groups and things like that. Could you explain that a little more for our philosophical audience?
Yeah, it's really important to acknowledge this. I mean, Seneca talks about this universal fellowship, right? But he also says some things that are, well, pretty harsh. He can be dismissive of people from lower social classes. He can be dismissive of people outside Roman culture. And his views on women, well, they definitely reflect the prejudices of his time.
Right. It's important to keep those things in mind. I mean, he was a man of his time. But even so, his ideas are worth thinking about. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about philosophical psychology. What's the Stoic picture of the soul? Because that really underpins a lot of Seneca's thinking, right?
Absolutely. So for the Stoics, the soul is corporeal, which means it's physical. It's not some kind of immaterial spirit. It's made of a very refined kind of matter, but it's still matter.
Oh, interesting. So it's not like Plato's idea of the soul.
Not exactly. And sometimes Seneca uses language that sounds Platonic, but the Stoics were materialists in a sense, and they believed that the soul was rational.
So our thoughts, our decisions, they're all physical processes.
In a way, yes. And the soul was also unified. They didn't believe in this idea that there was like a rational part of the soul and an irrational part that were always battling it out.
So how do they explain like irrational behavior?
Well, they would say that what we call irrationality is really just a kind of malfunctioning of the rational soul. It's like the soul is essentially rational, but it can get corrupted by false beliefs or bad habits.
I see. So it's not that we have these separate parts of ourselves that are good and bad. It's more like our rational soul can just kind of go off track sometimes.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Now, one term we see a lot with Seneca is voluntas, will.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think Seneca basically discovered the will as a philosophical concept?
That's a tricky one. I mean, voluntas and the verb vel, to will or to want, these words are all over Seneca's writings. And some people have said that he was a major influence on later thinkers like Augustine, who really developed the idea of the will.
Okay, so he was onto something, but maybe didn't fully articulate it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Nowadays, scholars tend to think that what Seneca's really doing is exploring the experience of decision-making and self-improvement. Like, he's really interested in how we make choices, how we commit ourselves to goals, how we try to become better people. And he sees all these things as involving acts of willing.
So it's less about saying, here's a new part of the mind, the will, and more about describing these mental acts as acts of willing.
Exactly. It's like he's doing phenomenology, describing the experience of these mental acts.
Right. And Seneca really emphasizes self-examination, right? Like he's always telling Lucilius to examine his conscience, to reflect on his day.
Oh, absolutely. Especially on anger. He recommends doing this evening examination of your day. And for Seneca, this is super important. He thinks we have a tendency to get in our own way. He says, tibi graves eris, you'll be a burden to yourself. Or, tu tibi molestus, as you are troublesome to yourself. And he thinks the way to overcome this is through self-reflection. By looking at our thoughts and actions, we can start to see where we're going wrong and make changes.
It's like he's anticipating modern ideas of self-awareness and personal growth. And the French historian Vane, he said we can abuse Seneca by reading our own modern concerns about the self back into his work. But I kind of like that idea.
Me too. It's not necessarily historically accurate, but it can be really productive. And it connects nicely to Pierre Hadot's idea of spiritual exercises. This wasn't just theory for the Stoics. It was about putting these ideas into practice.
So how does this focus on the self fit with the Stoic idea of oikeiosis, which is often translated as affiliation?
That's a great question. Because for the Stoics, it's not just about focusing on yourself. They believed we have a natural affiliation not only with ourselves, but with our family, our community, even the entire cosmos. It's about recognizing our interconnectedness with everything.
Okay, so how do those two things go together? The focus on the self and this sense of connection with everything else.
Well, I think for Seneca, it's about finding a balance. He's drawing on Socrates, know thyself. But he's not saying we should just become hermits and focus only on our inner lives. We also have a duty to engage with the world, to act justly, to contribute to the common good. It's like that idea we were talking about earlier, the philosopher and the citizen existing together in the same person.
Gotcha. It's about integrating those two sides of ourselves. And the outline mentions one more step, right? turning to nature and even to God. Why is that important?
Yeah, I think Seneca recognized that it's easy to get caught up in our own little world, to become too focused on our own problems and desires. And he thought that by studying nature, by contemplating the cosmos, we could gain a wider perspective. It's like zoom out, see the bigger picture, and by understanding the natural order of things, we can start to accept things that are outside our control, like death.
So it's a way of finding peace, finding acceptance.
Exactly. And this leads him to theology. For Seneca, the ultimate goal is to become like God. Not literally, of course, but to become more rational, more virtuous, more in harmony with the universe.
That's really interesting. Okay, let's talk about emotions. The Stoics had a whole therapy for the emotions, right? What was their goal? I mean, did they think we should just try to get rid of all emotions?
Well, not exactly. The Stoics, and Seneca too, they recognized that we have emotions. They called them pathy, passions. Things like fear, anger, grief.
Yeah, and they didn't think those were good things.
Right. They thought passions were based on false judgments, and they thought the goal was to free ourselves from these passions to achieve a state of apatheia, which sometimes gets translated as apathy, but it's really more like tranquility or peace of mind.
So it's not about becoming emotionless. It's about having a different kind of emotional life, one that's grounded in reason. What about those really quick reactions we have to things, like before we even have time to think?
The Stoics called those propatheiae, or first movements, and Seneca acknowledges that we can't control these. They just happen.
Okay, so they're kind of automatic.
Exactly. It's like you see a snake and you jump back. That's a propatheia. But then, once you've had that initial reaction, you can use your reason to decide how to respond.
So that's where the Stoic training comes in, right?
Yep.
Learning to manage your emotions.
Right. And one thing that people often find confusing is why the Stoics rejected the idea of moderate emotions. Like, why not just try to keep your emotions in check?
Yeah, that seems reasonable, right?
Seneca would say, no way. He has this great line where he says, the idea of moderate emotions is as absurd as moderate insanity. I mean, for him, emotions are just bad judgments, and you can't have a little bit of a bad judgment. It'll just lead to more bad judgment.
Okay, I can see his point.
Okay.
So how did Seneca specifically deal with anger, fear, and grief? Because those are all pretty powerful emotions.
Yeah, and he wrote a whole treatise on anger. He sees anger as really destructive, and he gives all these strategies for preventing it.
Makes sense, since anger was Nero's problem, right?
Yeah.
Maybe Seneca had some experience dealing with that.
Maybe. For fear, especially fear of death, he thought it was paradoxical. Like, we want to preserve ourselves, but the fear of death makes us anxious and prevents us from really living. So he really emphasized accepting death as part of nature.
Kind of a memento mori type of thing.
Totally. And for grief, he thought we should try to understand it through reason. Like, loss is a natural part of life, and we shouldn't let our grief overwhelm us.
So what about feeling anger or sadness about injustice? I mean, shouldn't a good person feel those things?
Seneca talks about this on Peace of Mind. And his answer is a bit surprising. He basically says, no, you shouldn't feel anger or sadness about these things. You should respond with reason and a desire to correct the wrong. He would say that virtue is its own reward.
So no righteous indignation for Seneca.
Not really. He might even say something like, have faith that the person who did wrong can change, can be been better. Don't get bogged down in negative emotions.
That's a pretty optimistic way of looking at it.
Yeah.
And Seneca wrote a whole treatise on mercy, right? On mercy.
He did, and it's really interesting because in that work, he presents clementia, mercy, as a virtue, specifically a virtue for those in positions of power.
Like emperors, he's thinking of Nero again, right?
Probably. And it's about restraining yourself from being cruel, from being too harsh in your punishments. It's interesting, though, because the earlier Stoics didn't really talk about virtues that were specific to certain roles.
Yeah, that does seem different.
It's a bit of a departure. And it probably has to do with the Roman context, this idea of the emperor as a kind of father figure who needs to show mercy to his subjects.
Okay, makes sense. Let's move on to Seneca's understanding of virtue itself. What were some of his key ideas there?
Well, one really important distinction he makes, which comes from the earlier Stoics, is between what's valuable and what's truly good. So there are things like health, wealth, reputation. These are things that we generally prefer to have rather than not have.
They have value, we might say.
Right, exactly. But they're not good in themselves. The only thing that's truly good is virtue.
Okay, so why not? What's wrong with health, wealth, and reputation?
Well, Seneca would say, think about it. Imagine you're worried about how much it costs to travel somewhere, or you're worried about whether the bread you're eating is stale, or you're worried about getting a fancy haircut. These are all external things, and they don't really contribute to your happiness. What really matters is whether you're acting virtuously.
He uses a lot of these everyday examples, doesn't he?
He does, and I think it helps to make his point. He wants to show that true happiness comes from within, from being a good person, not from having a lot of stuff or being popular.
He makes another distinction, right, between appropriate action and correct action.
Right. So an appropriate action is something that's reasonable to do in a given situation. It takes into account those things we were just talking about, health, wealth, and so on. And even someone who's not perfectly wise can do an appropriate action.
Okay, so what's a correct action?
A correct action is something that flows from perfect reason. It's the kind of action that only a perfectly wise person would do. It's completely consistent with virtue, with the overall good. And for Seneca, what matters is not the outcome of the action, but the choice itself. He says, what is good is that I choose well.
He also talks about precepta and decreta. What are those?
Decreta are the fundamental principles of Stoicism, like the big ideas. And precepta are more like rules of thumb, specific pieces of advice for how to live your life.
So the decreta are the theory, and the precepta are the practice.
Exactly. And Seneca thought you needed both. You need to understand the theory, but you also need practical guidance for how to apply it in your everyday life.
That makes sense. And one last thing on ethics. What did Seneca have to say about helping others?
Well, he was very much in line with the earlier Stoics on this. They believed that the ultimate good is to benefit others. And Seneca thought this could be done through public service or through philosophy. Even just by living a virtuous life, you're benefiting those around you. He has this great line where he says that even if a virtuous person doesn't hold any public office, their life is still beneficial. Their very presence, their way of walking, their expression, even their silence, all of these things can benefit others.
Wow, I love that image. Okay, let's finish up by talking about Seneca's views on physics and theology. I mean, those might seem like pretty different topics, but for him, they were all connected, right?
Yeah, totally. And he lays out his views on physics in his work, Natural Questions. And one of the big things he's trying to do there is to explain natural phenomena in a way that will help people to overcome their fears and superstitions.
That's interesting because that's something the Epicureans were really focused on too, right?
It is, but they had very different approaches. Seneca was more interested in using natural philosophy to understand God. He even says he wants to take measure of God through studying nature.
Okay, so how did he understand God?
Well, for him, God is basically everything. Everything visible and invisible, the soul of the world, the rational principle that governs everything. And he uses all kinds of different names for God. Fate, nature, providence.
So it's a very pantheistic view.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. And Seneca believed that God was good, that God cared for humanity. And this is actually one of the arguments he makes in On Benefits. He says that the very fact that we can give and receive benefits is proof of God's goodness.
That's a really interesting connection. And he thought it was important to study nature, to try to understand this divine order.
Absolutely. And for Seneca, one of the most important things about natural philosophy was that it could help us to accept our own mortality. You know, he famously said, mors naturae lex est. Death is the law of nature.
And the goal is to live in accordance with this natural order, right? To become like God as much as possible.
Exactly. It's about aligning yourself with the rational principle that governs the universe. And for Seneca, that's the path to true happiness.
Well, there you have it, folks. That was Seneca in a nutshell. We've looked at his life, his philosophy, his ideas about virtue, emotions, nature, God. There's a lot to take in, but I hope you found it helpful.
Yeah, and I hope it's given you some things to think about. Because one of the things that's so great about Seneca is that his work is still relevant today. You know, we're still struggling with the same questions he was grappling with. How to live a good life, how to deal with difficult emotions, how to find meaning and purpose in a world that can often seem chaotic and unpredictable.
Definitely. So, for our listeners out there, the philosophical minds in the crowd, here's a question for you. How do Seneca's ideas resonate with you today? Does his emphasis on reason and self-control still make sense in a world where we talk so much about emotional intelligence? Or is there a different path to happiness, to virtue, to fulfillment? Think about it, wrestle with it. And if you're feeling inspired, go check out Seneca's writings for yourself. There's a lot of wisdom to be found there.
I couldn't agree more.
Until next time, keep diving deep.